Hello folks, and welcome to our next video about secondary messengers. So we already know that hormones induce changes in target cells because those target cells have specific receptors on them, right? Now, the receptors can work different because we have different types of hormones. We have the steroid hormones and the amino acid-based hormones. And steroids can pass through the cell membrane, whereas amino acids cannot pass through them. So let's focus on these amino acid hormones. How can they induce a change inside the cell if the hormone has to stay on the outside the cell? That's going to be our focus. And the way they do that is through the cyclic AMP signaling cascade. And this is going to be the main one that we focus on. We don't focus on any other signaling cascades. Of course, there's many others, but our focus is going to be cyclic AMP, which for short is CAMP. So let's get through how this all works. First, we know the hormone has to bind to a receptor, specific receptor on the cell membrane, right? And those specific receptors are going to be called G protein coupled receptors. So that means it's basically a protein that's embedded in the actual plasma membrane that has a G protein attached to it. That's what I mean by G protein coupled. And we will just call these GPCRs, okay? So they're just going to be a class of membrane-bound receptors that's going to initiate the signaling cascade. And what can we say by signaling cascade? Signaling cascade is basically a multi-step chain of intracellular events. So once that hormone binds the GPCR, or again, the membrane-bound receptor, that receptor is going to cause a cascade of multi-chain steps that's going to allow us to then get that signal inside of the cell, or intracellular. If you have all these other proteins that are involved in this signaling cascade, then they're usually going to be linked in a specific series. That means once one thing happens, then another thing happens, and it kind of just goes through until you actually send that signal intracellular. And again, our example of the signaling cascade is going to be cyclic AMP. So cyclic means that there's some kind of cyclical portion of the molecule, and AMP, well, we know ATP is adenosine triphosphate, AMP is adenosine monophosphate, and we just go ahead and call it CAMP. That's going to be our common example. Now, these signals, which we'll talk about later, can also be amplified, and we'll talk about areas where there can be amplification. But first, let's go ahead and get started with the hormone. The hormone, as we can see here, that's going to be our epinephrine, just like our other amino-based hormone that we saw before. And this hormone is going to bind to that GPCR, or that receptor. And that's going to transmit a signal across the membrane. So as you can see, this particular epinephrine is going to bind to the GPCR because it's specific, and then this receptor is going to jumpstart a signaling cascade. Okay? So again, the hormone binds to the receptor, which is GPCR, and then GPCR is going to activate the G protein that's coupled with it. So again, this will be our GPCR here in blue. This will be the G protein that is coupled with it. And so because they're coupled together, once you actually have that hormone bind to GPCR and receive that message, then it's going to then activate the G protein we have here as well. And what's going to happen is that G protein is going to go from a lower energy, GDP, to a higher energy, GTP, so that it has the ability to diffuse down the plasma membrane. Now, what is GDP and what is GTP? Again, we know ATP, adenosine triphosphate, AMP, adenosine monophosphate, ADP, adenosine diphosphate. Well, guess what? We have another nucleotide here, guanosine. So this is going to be guanosine triphosphate, that's GTP. And then we have guanosine diphosphate, that's GTP. Which one's the higher energy? The one that has 3 phosphate groups. The one that has 2 phosphate groups is going to be less energy. And of course, when you have that monophosphate group, which we'll get to later on, they are going to have just only 1 phosphate group for energy. So that GPCR is now going to, again, activate the G protein, and that's going to replace GDP with GTP on that G protein, giving it enough energy to then diffuse along the membrane. Okay, so now we have this hyped up G protein that's going to diffuse along the membrane, and some folks might say, why doesn't it just continue to move intracellularly? Well, this G protein does have a lot of hydrophobic areas or portions that allows it to kind of stay close to the cell membrane itself. Okay, so that G protein is going to travel, and then bind to this larger protein here, which is an enzyme called adenylate cyclase. So that enzyme, adenylate cyclase, gets activated once that G protein binds to it. So let's go ahead and start from the beginning. We have a hormone that's going to bind to the GPCR receptor. That GPCR receptor is going to activate the G protein, creating GTP from GDP. That's going to give that G protein enough energy to be able to diffuse along the plasma membrane and bind to and activate an enzyme, which is adenylate cyclase. Now, once this adenylate cyclase is all juiced up and activated from that G protein, it's going to convert ATP, that's freely in the cytoplasm, to cyclic AMP, which is the focus of the entire name of this secondary messenger system, okay? So we can see here we have ATP. How can we recognize it? It has 3 phosphate groups. And then that's going to be converted to cyclic AMP. So you see a phosphate group here. There's kind of like this little cyclical part that's right in between the adenosine portion and, of course, the phosphate. And that's how you create cyclic AMP, or again, cyclic adenosine monophosphate. So again, let's review. As you can see, I keep reviewing the steps over and over again because it's going to be very important to kind of get it in your brain. Number 1, the hormone, the amino acid-based hormone, is going to bind to the GPCR receptor. That GPCR receptor is going to activate the G protein that's coupled with it, replacing GDP with GTP. Now the G protein has enough energy to diffuse down the plasma membrane and bind to and activate a larger enzyme called the adenylate cyclase enzyme. That adenylate cyclase enzyme is going to convert ATP to cyclic AMP. Now, once that cyclic AMP is now created, it's going to bind to yet another protein, and that's going to be protein kinase A, okay? Now, once it actually binds to this protein kinase A, which you'll see that basically you have a little bit of cyclic AMP binding to the kinase protein, and this is our kinase in blue. That kinase protein has a big job. It has the ability to phosphorylate other proteins. Phosphorylate just means adding a phosphate group to something else. In this case, the kinase is going to add a phosphate group to other proteins. And once you add that phosphate group to other proteins, you're going to get some type of cellular response, meaning the message from the hormone finally got through to the cell. Okay? So in other words, you can say the kinase that's in the cytoplasm, once it's activated by the cyclic AMP, is going to turn on proteins by adding phosphate groups to them. And depending on where they're going inside the cell, they can have different functions. Look at this again. A hormone, which again is an amino acid-based hormone, like epinephrine, is going to bind to a receptor on the outside of the cell. So it's going to bind to a GPCR receptor. Now the GPCR receptor is coupled with the G protein. So once the hormone binds to it, it's going to activate that G protein. And it's going to replace GDP with GTP. So it's essentially giving the G protein energy so that it can diffuse along the membrane and bind to this large enzyme called adenylate cyclase. Now, adenylate cyclase, once it's activated, it's going to convert ATP, that's in the cytosol, to cyclic AMP, which is the name of this entire signaling cascade. Once cyclic AMP is formed, it's going to bind to kinase, which is going to be the protein here, the blue protein that's in the actual cytosol. So you see that cyclic AMP, I wrote it down here, binding to the kinase. And that kinase can then start adding phosphate groups to other proteins that are intracellular to create a cellular response so that the message is getting through, so that you can have certain functions from those proteins carried out. Okay, folks, there is a lot to remember. That's why I keep on repeating it. But there's also a little cute little thing that they give you in your textbook to help you kind of remember this. Holding really great activities at CAMP kinase. So holding is going to be a hormone. The R really is going to be the receptor, which is GPCR. The great is going to come from the G protein. The A is going to come from adenylate cyclase being activated by the G protein. And then CAMP kinase is going to come from the CAMP that's actually created from ATP, converting to cyclic AMP due to adenylate cyclase. And of course, the kinase that can just add phosphates to other proteins and trigger that cellular response. So you could just remember holding really great activities at CAMP kinase to help you remember the steps in this whole process. Now let's briefly talk about amplification. So cascades, or the signaling cascades, can be amplified when one molecule passes a signal to multiple molecules. Now we have to think of all these little steps here, 1 through 6, and figure out what areas can actually cause more molecules to pass through. So the hormone binding to the receptor, there's not going to be any amplification here. Why? Because the hormone is specific to that single receptor. But what about the GPCR, the actual receptor itself? This GPCR has the ability to activate multiple G proteins. So it doesn't just have to be this one G protein here. You can have another G protein, another G protein, and another G protein, right? And so because it has the ability to activate multiple G proteins, then guess what? Those G proteins have the ability to activate more adenylate cyclases. So, for example, there can be adenylate cyclase here, adenylate cyclase here, adenylate cyclase here. So the first little area of amplification will be the GPCR being able to, of course, activate many G proteins. Now the G proteins, because they specifically have to bind to adenylate cyclase, there's not going to be any amplification with G protein itself. If I make 5 G proteins because of the activation from the GPCR, then those 5 G proteins will then bind to 5 adenylate cyclases. Okay? But once you get to adenylate cyclase, well, guess what? It has the ability to make several cyclic AMPs. So we can have one, you can have another AMP, cyclic AMP. So because it can make many cyclic AMPs because of ATP just moving around in the actual cytosol, and of course because we have a lot more adenylate cyclase that's being activated due to the multiple G proteins, then guess what? We can actually have an amplification at this step. So this step here with the GPCR and also the adenylate cyclase, I will say step 2. And step 4 are the main ones that we can see having amplification. Now, because we have a lot of cyclic AMP, you might be saying, oh, we're about to have even more amplification. Well, let's think about it. The cyclic AMP has to bind to the kinase enzyme, that protein. So if I have 4 cyclic AMPs here, they're only going to be able to bind to 4 kinases. So just keep that in mind as well. So there's not going to be any amplification at the cyclic AMP portion. And then finally, we have kinases. Now, we know kinases have the ability to amplify because however many kinases are going to be formed from all those cyclic AMPs, they have the ability to add phosphate groups to all different types of proteins. So say this kinase can add it to 5 proteins that need to have that cellular response. That means this kinase can have that as well. So again, you're looking at 10 different proteins that are going to have a cellular response just from one kinase. So we definitely have amplification here. So those are the 3 areas in this signaling cascade, specifically the cyclic AMP or CAMP signaling cascade, where you can have amplification. Now let's go ahead and get into details about the major hormones of the pancreas and adrenal glands, just to kind of wrap up information that's going into specifically the endocrine system. All right. First things first, I'm only focusing on the pancreas and adrenal glands, but of course, if you want more hormone details, you can look at table 16.3 or 16.5 in your textbook. But we will always be coming back to some of the other hormones as the semester progresses, okay, especially when we get to the reproductive system. Now, let's go ahead and focus on the pancreas first, and then we'll get into the adrenal glands. As you can see, the pancreas is a long yellow gland that's going to be tucked in by the stomach, and the whole goal of the pancreas is to regulate blood sugar and blood glucose level. Okay, so sometimes to remember what the pancreas actually is going to secrete, it said the pancreas is covered in glue. The N is going to come from insulin, see here, and the glue is going to come from glucagon. And what do these 2 things do? Of course, they're going to help with homeostasis of the blood sugar. What do I mean by homeostasis? When you're thinking of blood sugar, yes, it does have a negative feedback loop when it comes to the pancreas. Okay, so just keep that in mind, because we're going to be going into more detail on that in the next video. So insulin is going to decrease blood sugar. How? By converting glucose to glycogen in the liver. Okay? Too much glucose in the blood, insulin is going to say, hey, store it in the liver, right? Glucagon, on the other hand, by opposite, is going to increase blood sugar. Why or how? It's going to take that glycogen and now break it down into glucose so it can be released into the bloodstream. So these are the 2 hormones of the pancreas gland that we're going to focus on. Now, you see that this kind of have shades of blue here, and then there's shades of yellow here. These shades of blue means that we're dealing with amino acid-based hormones. So that insulin, that glucagon is water soluble, but we also know that they can't just cross the cell membrane. They're going to need help through those signaling cascades that we saw before. Now, insulin itself, again, it's going to increase glucose in the blood. We're going to get more details. Glucagon is going to take either glycogen from the liver. That's like a bigger example we talk about, but we're also going to get glycogen from fat cells, and then, of course, turn that into glucose so that we can increase the blood sugar. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the adrenal glands. Now, first things first, let's orient ourselves. We have the kidneys here. There's a kidney. Let me get a better color. There's a kidney here, and then there's a kidney here. Here's the adrenal gland that looks like a little hat on top of the kidney, and another one over here. So you have an adrenal gland on top of each kidney, okay? Now, adrenal glands, if you want to remember them, again, they're endocrine glands, but if you want to remember them, you can say adrenaline equals stress. And that kind of encompasses all the different hormones that we're going to focus on for the adrenal glands. So first, we have epinephrine, which we also call adrenaline, and norepinephrine. These are both going to work together and be a part of that fight or flight response. So if you do have that fight response, then you're going to have an increase in your heart rate so that you can escape, right? If you have that flight response, excuse me, you want to be able to get out of there. So you're going to have an increase in heart rate. It's going to be very rapid so that you can actually use all the energy you can to escape. But if you have that fight response, for example, that means you're going to increase the contractility of your muscles. Your muscles are going to tense up. You're ready for a battle. You're going to be tunnel focused. You're going to be very aware of your surroundings. You're not going to be focused on anything else but trying to fight your way out. Hear that when folks are going through kind of traumatic events or they're going through some type of fight or flight response, they have adrenaline that sometimes they don't even realize their own injuries, for example, because the adrenaline's so high. And it could take a while for you to actually feel the pain that you're going through because either you were just putting your energy into flight or you're putting your energy into fighting things. And next we have glucocorticoids, which is all basically called cortisol, okay? And this is a part of the stress response. So they're both going to be a part of the stress response. Again, this is going to be amino acid hormone. This is a steroid hormone. That means, yes, it can cross that cell membrane, but it definitely needs a transport protein to help it get there. All right, now what do we mean by stress here? This is going to be stress that's like, again, fight or flight. This is going to be stress that it has long-term effects. So have a cortisol response. That doesn't mean like, oh, I'm about to just run. It means that you're talking about changes to your metabolism in response to stress. That's going to be the big part here. So, for example, when you have a high amount of cortisol, guess what? It also can increase your blood sugar, make it hard for you to lose weight, make it hard for you to be able to function normally. And of course, some things are tied to obesity and stuff as well, which we'll talk about in the next video. But I just need to make sure that we understand that when you're talking about cortisol, you're talking about long-term stress response that messes up your metabolism. Like I said, some folks also have like stress eating, which again can cause blood sugar changes or changes to your overall weight and body. Now that we kind of went through the signaling cascade for amino acid hormones and also just some major hormones of the pancreas and adrenal glands, let's go ahead and get into some worksheet example or a worksheet example for this information. And I'm going to focus on number 8. It said the steps of the cascade using cyclic AMP are given below. So they give us all these different steps here, okay? Write the letter for the appropriate step and the blanks below to put the pathway in order. So they already give us a hormone, right? You can also keep on saying holding really great activities at CAMP kinase to help you kind of remember. But I like to kind of go through and make sure I know what's going on. So protein kinase, we're talking about kinase. ATP is converted to cyclic AMP. That means we're talking about adenylate cyclase, right? G protein is activated. That means that GPCR activated that G protein. Then it says adenylate cyclase is activated. That means that G protein binded to that adenylate cyclase. Okay? Let's go ahead and put these things in order. So first we said the hormones are going to bind to the extracellular receptor. That's fine, right? So once the hormone is bound to the receptor, what's going to happen? That receptor is going to activate the G protein. So I automatically know that I can put letter C here. That's the first step. Now you don't have to go in exact order. You can just put the last step here if you wanted to, right before cellular response. Whatever's going to make it easier for you. So for example, let's go ahead and do that. Now, we know right before cellular response, we are dealing with the kinase. So you can automatically put letter A here if you want to put kinase. Let's continue on. Once that G protein gets activated, what is it going to do? It's going to bind to adenylate cyclase. That's the reason why I wrote my own notes to this, because if it just says adenylate cyclase is activated, you might be like, wait a minute, where's the G protein part? You kind of have to write that out. So we're going to put letter D here. Okay? Once we have our adenylate cyclase that's activated, what's going to happen? It's going to convert ATP to cyclic AMP. So that's going to be our letter B. Now, we already saw that letter A is going to be here, but let's talk about it. Once we have that cyclic AMP, what is it going to do? It's going to bind to kinase. Once it binds to kinase, kinase therefore gets activated. So that's what letter A is all about. The kinase gets activated. Once the kinase is activated, it's going to start adding a phosphate or phosphorylating other proteins for that cellular response. So there's little parts that they didn't bring in, like the kinase portion. They just called it cellular response in general. They didn't talk about the hormones in one of their answer choices, but I want to show you this type of question because if you get this type of question, then you want to make sure that you can start breaking down the information, writing notes on the side if you need to help you kind of figure out what's going on so you can memorize, of course, the little pieces that are going on when it comes to the cyclic AMP signaling cascade, and then get the correct response. So hopefully this helps. We're going to now go into talking about diabetes and also some homeostasis stuff when it comes to blood glucose.